Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TR for Let's Talk. Today we have with us once again Anurag Goel, founder and CEO of Render. Anurag, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Swapnil. It's great to be back.
It's my pleasure to host you here again today. And today, there is so much to talk about. But before we deep dive into Render, the cloud platform, let's quickly remind our viewers what is Render all about? What problem you folks are trying to solve? What problem you saw in the space that led to the creation of this company?
The biggest problem that we're trying to solve is cutting through cloud complexity. So when you think about the hyperscalers, AWS, GCP, Azure, others, they have a lot of low-level primitives that you have to understand how to use. You have to hire people as a company to who can use these services and who know how to glue them together. And every company ends up building some sort of internal developer platform that fundamentally looks the same because they all want the same thing from the cloud, but they're having to do a lot of work on an ongoing basis to get things like scalability, flexibility, uptime, networking, storage, compute. And so Render has built a higher level platform that allows application developers to manage everything in the cloud themselves. So we focus on building a platform that anyone building any application can use without any kind of knowledge of how AWS works, how Kubernetes works, but with the same kind of capabilities and scaling and functionality and security and reliability that they would get from building all of it themselves.
So if we look at Render, are we looking at it as a competitor to hyperscalers like AWS, GCP, or it looks like kind of complementary to them? I just want to understand where
Yeah,
we are.
I would say it's complementary because, like I said, the hyperscalers are very good at building these low-level primitives, at building data centers, at getting hardware installed and working and reliable. And so I think we let them do what they are great at. What they aren't great at is building end-to-end experiences that can finally be used at the end of the day by the people who are building the apps, as opposed to getting a PhD in AWS. So our goal is to run at a much higher level of abstraction than the hyperscalers do. But at the same time, we work very closely with the hyperscalers to allow our customers to use the decades of work that have gone into making these core primitives like around compute, networking, storage reliable and scalable.
And you hit on some of the pain points when I talk to companies: complexity, cost, scaling. And you're right, you need to be a PhD if you want to use some of these hyperscalers. The whole idea of cloud, I mean, basically was to make things easier. Yes, it does make things easy, but you still have to deal with a lot of complexity. You have to deal with cost as well. So now, since you also established that Render is complementary, so talk a bit about why should developers, and also before we go there, who is your target audience? Developer, DevOps, DevSecOps?
Yeah.
Because nowadays we have a lot of labels we use, right? Platform
Yes.
engineering and SRE. So let's talk
Yes.
about your audience and let's talk about how running or using Render, first of all, lowers the barrier of entry
Yeah.
and also make it easy, inexpensive for them to be also able to use services from AWS, GCP, Azure, and other cloud platform.
Absolutely. So let's take the first one. How does render actually make it easy, and who are we servicing? So at the end of the day, we look, our platform is the best way for application developers, full stack engineers, sometimes front end engineers or back end engineers. These are not people who have DevOps in their title. They're not platform engineers. They're the people actually building, writing the application logic, the business code. And we allow them to deploy incredibly easily to the cloud. It's all fully integrated with GitHub. All they need to do is push to Git, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, what have you, or run a container image. And we take care of everything from that point on: scaling, security, SSL, internal networking, private networking, service discovery, auto scaling, HTTP2, HTTP3, CDNs, Postgres, fully managed databases like Postgres and also Redis. And so we have this all-in-one platform that makes it very easy for application developers to get started. But the big difference from other platforms in our space is that we also focus very heavily on helping companies grow on the platform. So with legacy platforms, for example, with something like, say, Heroku, you see that companies get to a certain point and then they scale out. They ultimately end up going the route of, at the end of the day, building a whole DevOps team and working on AWS. And our focus is on helping companies scale indefinitely at this new abstraction level that we're providing. And we do that by working very closely with our fastest growing customers and really listening closely to what they need as they scale and building those capabilities into the platform. But the second question around how do we make it easier to consume these third-party services, we allow companies to create completely private networking links to their third-party services from vendors. So if, for example, you're using AWS Bedrock, we can set up a private networking connection from your render service or your render database to your AWS Bedrock service. So you can use it without going over the public internet and without adding additional latency. And because render runs on top of GCP and AWS and likely eventually Azure, we can give people the ability to access third-party services from any of these clouds and run their core workloads on render on top of one of these clouds, but they don't have to worry about managing anything. They don't even need to have an AWS account.
When we look at this whole, cloud native ecosystem, if you look at CNCF, the landscape is massive. Tons of project, which is healthy, great things to have. So many open source project creates a good ecosystem for players to play around. Talk a bit of how Render is either involved with some of these open source projects, or is, I've been covering open source since day one. Open source, in my view, is not just about releasing your code. Sometimes supporting open source project in a way that just enabling people to be able to run those projects, because open source can solve day one problem. Day two is where the challenges are. So talk a bit about how do you folks work with this whole CNCF landscape with projects like Kubernetes as well.
Yeah, so behind the scenes, Render is using projects like Kubernetes, but again, that's not really exposed to our end users. Our end users get the features that they want, like scalability, autoscaling, and reliability, private networking. All of that is operated at a much higher level. And now we might use Kubernetes behind the scenes, but at the same time, we have changed significant parts of Kubernetes, like how scheduling works, to suit the end of the day, the developer experience that we want our customers to have. Now, that is very specific to render. At the same time, if we fix a bug or find a bug, then we engage with the Kubernetes community or the people who are building a specific part of Kubernetes, or not just Kubernetes, but also projects like Calico or others. And we're working with the maintainers and making sure that if we can contribute anything back, then we do. And at the same time, we stay close to them to understand what their roadmap is, so we can bring some of their new capabilities to our application engineers who don't want to do any kind of configuration of things like Kubernetes or Calico or Istio, but they still want the core power that these things can give you.
One thing more I want to ask you is that, of course, we are all, we love Kubernetes, we love open source, but sometimes, like with AI, Gen AI, it's like when you see folks see these technologies, everything starts to look like a hammer and a nail.
Yes,
So same thing happens with Kubernetes. Can you also
absolutely.
talk about there are a lot of use cases where Kubernetes makes perfect sense. Linux kernel, the word runs on the kernel. Kubernetes is playing a big role. But are there any use cases or cases where render might be more suitable for developer teams than going with the full-blown Kubernetes clusters?
Yeah, so I think unless you are building a cloud infrastructure company yourself, you really shouldn't be using something like Kubernetes directly, because you can get everything that you actually want from Kubernetes, like, you know, compute flexibility, scaling, networking, storage. you can get all of those things from render without having to manage anything or even know the word Kubernetes. But if you're a cloud infrastructure company like Render, or for example, if you're building a cloud database, I can see where instead of using Render, Kubernetes might be a better choice for you because you can configure it or control it to suit your infrastructure product. And but if you're building a B2B SaaS app or even a consumer app, there is really no reason for you to use Kubernetes directly. Kubernetes was never meant to be, I think, used by every company in the world. I think only infrastructure companies should be the ones using and understanding Kubernetes.
And how about things like Heroku? The fact is, everybody likes Heroku, but nobody wants to deal with it.
Yeah, part of that is Heroku was obviously acquired by Salesforce in 2010. And for a while, I think that they were able to add new capabilities as Salesforce did support them. But starting around 2015 or so, their pace of releasing new things slowed down considerably. And so we often hear from Heroku customers that every year they get a big increase in their contract without really any kind of improvement to the product. And so that's when they start looking at alternatives like Render. But to give you a simple example, you cannot right now protect if you go self-serve on Heroku and sign up for a Postgres database, you can't really protect it from the public internet. And so a lot of people come to us for things like private networking that are just built into the product. There's also a lot of other things that we do that Heroku doesn't. And the final thing I'll say is we've been able to offer many more compute options and database options than Heroku does today. And then we'll continue to introduce more. But also, our cost structure scales much better with usage. And that is where, again, a lot of companies look at how much they have to pay Heroku for something. And they start, especially when they're being asked to pay 10% more every year or even more every year without a corresponding improvement to the platform. That's when they start looking at providers and they ultimately find that Render is the best choice for them as an alternative.
And talk a bit about, because that's why we use the term hyperscalers. How does render scale depending on how customers plan to scale and grow?
Yeah, so Render automatically, elastically scales in and out based on our customers' growth. So we have customers who have scaled from just the three people who started a company to now hundreds of people, and they're all using Render right now. And uh, we have been able to scale with their growth because we've continued to add new capabilities that they've needed as they've grown. And at the same time, our platform itself is built to auto scale. And if you expect like a traffic spike, for example, we can very transparently just handle it. If you turn on auto scaling, we make sure that you stay up at all times. And behind the scenes, we're completely unknown to you, very transparently. We're balancing, load balancing requests and making sure that we take application instances that might not be responding anymore. We take them out of commission. So we handle all of that with you. But most people never really, if they've turned on auto scaling, that's all they need to do. Most people never have to touch another click in Render's interface. And so we've been able to scale now to, people are launching over 300,000 applications on Render, services on Render every month. And we're adding more than 100,000 developers to the platform every month. And we're close to 2 million developers on the platform now.
These days, new technologies, new trends, new paradigm shifts, they keep happening. And I'm not talking the culture shifts. I'm talking from technology's perspective. Like right now, the hottest, at least for now, is Gen AI. I mean,
Of
AI has
course.
been around for a long
Yeah.
time. Um, Depending on how you look at it, we are pushing things to edge. EVs are becoming popular. EVs are more or less like supercomputers on wheels. How do you look at some of these new use cases? Because new use cases bring their own challenges. They have their own set of problems that you have to solve. When we look at render, how do you enable these kind of new use cases to be able to leverage render and mitigate some of the challenges, complexity that comes with general hyperscaling?
So that is something that we've constantly been in touch with our customers on. And one of the things that we do out of the box is if you want to store vector embeddings using a retrieval augmented generation architecture, RAG architecture, then we make that possible on render pretty easily because our managed Postgres product has PG vector, which is a very common extension built in. And so we have a lot of customers who are using render in a way that is core to their native AI native business. In fact, one of the largest top 50 consumer or engineering apps called Black Box AI. They run on render and they've scaled on render from the very beginning. And there's many more AI companies that have grown on render over time. Now, next year, we are probably going to spend more of our engineering bandwidth on building, supporting more AI use cases, but it all comes down to what do our customers want and how can we best help them? Now, if they, for example, say, look, I don't actually want access to GPUs. Instead, I want you to build object storage. We have a relatively efficient team, and we want to make sure that we prioritize the things that solve customers' problems the fastest and their biggest problems. So if object storage is their big problem, then we'll go build that as opposed to offering GPUs natively. But that's a constant product prioritization exercise that we're running and expect to hear more from us over the coming months.
Today modern organizations, they do want to see where things are moving so that they're not left behind, so they do like to get their hands dirty, and they also like to dip their toes in the latest technology that is going on. But you don't want them to compromise with the stability they're catering to the customers. They don't want. So how does render enable customers to continue to kind of explore new technologies without having to compromise with the stability and the scale that you folks offer?
Absolutely. I think this gets at the core of what render is. We focus on using and testing the latest advances in technology, in cloud infrastructure technology, and then bringing them to our customers in a way that remains reliable. So we're doing all of this work for them. So you never have to worry about, how does my infrastructure use the latest and greatest while still remaining stable? Because behind the scenes, render is, for example, upgrading to the latest version of, say, something like Calico, and then Calico brings new functionality, and we just automatically enable that for application engineers in a way that makes sense for their applications. Their applications automatically become more performant. They might get new security capabilities. And so instead of spending so much time on trying to test these technologies using a large DevOps team, companies can instead continue to focus their engineering resources, which are incredibly expensive, on delivering business value and iterating on products faster and ultimately outcompeting others in the market.
Anurag, thank you so much for joining me today and talk about render and how you folks solve problems for the teams. Thanks for great insights. And as usual, I would love to have you folks back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapnil. It was great to be here and would love to be back as well.